policy, and this is one of our Tahrir Dialogues. For those who have not attended the Tahrir Dialogues with us before, I'd just like to give a brief about what they are all about. The Tahrir Dialogue started right after the 25th of January revolution here at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. We believed that there was a need to interact more with the society and with the community and to contribute to raising awareness about a lot of issues that people were interested in learning more about. So ever since maybe February after the revolution, we started holding panels mainly at the Tahrir campus, right in the middle of where everything was happening, about different problems and different debatable issues that people were concerned about. We discussed over the past 2 years constitutional amendments. We discussed the formation of political parties and how young people can form political parties. We went into debates about the role of the media in monitoring elections, the role of civil society in monitoring elections. We discussed how to fight corruption and how to get back our lost resources that were embezzled over the past decades. And usually there is a big crowd, and usually also we do it in Tahrir, but due to the events that are currently again taking place over there in Tahrir, and it's the campus is not yet available to organize events, we decided to have this event over here at the new campus. Our discussion today is also about a very important topic, about leadership, and it's a topic that people would like to know about and learn more about, especially in the current times and with all what's happening in Egypt and people taking leadership position. Just only yesterday, we were having a similar discussion in our class of Essentials of Public Policy and Administration with many of the graduate students who are here today. And we started out the discussion asking them what are the competencies, skills, and abilities that they would like to see in a public manager, in a parliamentarian, in a leader working in a public context. And because, I think, mostly because of what's happening around us, we know what's missing. So most of the students had all the right answers there, and they pinpointed very correctly that there is a need for integrity. Maybe this was the first thing Mark asked for. Others asked for effective communication skills. You identified the need also for serving citizens, for commitment, for believing in what you do, for being capable of dealing with change, being flexible, being dynamic, being proactive rather than reactive. And then we try to review together what the literature says about the different leadership theories, all that in less than an hour, so you can imagine that we didn't cover that much. We just reviewed the titles of the different groups of leadership theories that are there available in the literature and what they talk about and what main ideas they present, starting with the trait theories to the behavioral theories to the situational theories to what's currently discussed about transformational, transactional leadership, or what's discussed relevant to servant leadership, especially in a public sector context. And today will be a continuation of the discussion we've started on, and we will get to learn more about what's new in the field of an area of leadership from a very eminent professor who is specialized in teaching graduate students like yourselves at George Washington University about leadership. And he's been doing that for the past 28 years. Professor Emeritus of Public Policy and Public Administration, Professor James Edwin Key from the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration, George Washington University. I'd like to introduce him a bit more. He has taught more than 20 different courses in the Masters of Public Administration and Masters of Public Policy programs at George Washington University. and over the years has served administratively as chair of the Department of Public Administration, as senior associate dean, interim dean for the former School of Business and Public Management. Professor Jet Key, in addition to his administrative academic experience at the university, has also a lot of previous practical managerial experience. He acted as the executive director, Department of Administrative Services in the state of Utah, among many different positions he's held. The governor's representative, staff advisory council, the National Governors Association in 83 to 85, the state budget director, state planning coordinator before that, director of development, special counsel and director, legislative assistant. Professor Jet Key has a BA from the University of Notre Dame in History and Political Science, then a JD from New York University School of Law, and an MPA from New York University as well, School of Public Administration. His publications are numerous, whether books, book chapters, or articles. I'll just read some of the titles to give you a clue, not all. Titles like Fiscal Decentralization Theory and Reform, Cost Effectiveness and Cost Benefit Analysis, Revenue Raising Partners, Strategic Management in Federal Government, Private Finance Initiatives, Crisis and Anti-Crisis, Why Recessions Weaken Washington and Strengthen State and Local Government, Current Issues in State Budget and Finance, The Rise of Competitive Federalism, Is Excellence in Public Sector Possible? We hope it's possible, right? And Professor Key as well, current interests are in leadership and in management across sectors, including networks and partnerships. He will have 2 referee journal articles published this year in Public Administration Review, examining the current state of the public enterprise, and another one will be published in the spring issue of Public Integrity that deals with public-private partnerships. And Professor Key is working currently on a new book entitled Governing Networks and Partnerships, Engaging Public Enterprise Organizations. And this is the book, I think, on which today's discussion and lecture is based. And we've passed on the PowerPoints that will be presented. And the discussion is under the title of Leadership in a Post-Bureaucratic Age. So we're very eager to hear from Professor Key. What about leadership in a post-bureaucratic age? What's new about leadership? Yes.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I was in Cairo in Egypt 10 years ago and had a chance to lecture at your old campus. And so it was wonderful today to see the new campus. It's really a beautiful campus, a place where hopefully great things will occur in terms of academic excellence and student and faculty learning. Before I get into my talk, I wanted to briefly explain my tie. This is my very special tie that I wore tonight for you. It's referred to as a bolo tie. It's a string tie or a bolo tie, and it's common in southwestern states in the United States, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada. And as indicated, I've recently retired. I've become an emeritus professor. My home now is in Tucson, Arizona, and so I thought it was appropriate for me to wear one of these bolo ties. The jewelry work, the stonework, is by the Navajo Nation, the Navajo Indians of Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado, and I enjoy their work, and they have a beautiful artistic quality. So, but I expect it's a little unusual. Maybe you haven't seen one before, so I thought I would tell you what that is. Well, I'm delighted to talk about this topic of leadership, particularly in light of the tremendous governance issues that you're facing in Egypt. And I obviously don't presume to be an expert on your particular situation. So what I want to focus on primarily today, and I would be glad to talk about anything that you're interested in talking about, but focus on some of the ideas that have come out of my current research, which has to deal with partnerships and networks and these new entities that are being formed that are engaging the public in a variety of different ways. I think that this is going to be a trend. Now, despite my topic, I don't think we're going to end bureaucracy anytime soon, but I do think we are moving into an era where bureaucracy in its current form is going to be less and less important in solving the current problems. And so my perspective is both one of leadership, but also dealing with sort of these new organizational entities that are being created and formed to deal with public problems. I've been fortunate in my career, both academically and prior to that in government, to have some leadership positions, but also to work for some outstanding leaders. I had an opportunity when I was still in school to work for Senator Robert Kennedy, and he was truly an inspirational leader to me, and framed some of my thinking about what leadership is about. In Utah, well, New York, I was there when the Governor Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York, and he was quite an interesting leader to watch. But when I was in Utah, I had an opportunity to work for an extraordinary governor by the name of Scott Matheson. And one of the interesting things about Matheson as the governor of the state is that when we worked with him, worked for him in various cabinet level positions, his first question was always, what's the best for the state? You know, the politics will sort themselves out. What's the best for the people of the state? And I thought that was an important lesson. I know you talked about servant leadership. To me, that's very much a hallmark of servant leadership, is to be thinking about what is best for the people of the state, what is best for others in terms of leadership. But Laila's mentioned that I've been associated with George Washington University for the last 28 years now. So although I have a practitioner experience, I've been very much an academic for a number of years, but have had a chance to work with some really excellent academic leaders, including the director of the Trachtenberg School, Catherine Newcomer, who's a good friend of both of ours, and has been the kind of servant leader in an academic setting that we would all hope to have. Students come first, faculty second, the administrative issues third. So we were always, she was a delightful person to work with, and somebody that I count as a close friend. Well, we're going to talk about the need for a new model of public administration. And my thesis or my argument is that increasingly the kind of public problems that we're dealing with are not being addressed adequately through traditional public administration mechanisms, but through a variety of partnerships and networks and independent or semi-independent actors. And we're referring to those in our book as public enterprise organizations, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And the reason why the problems are more difficult today is that they tend to be multidimensional. They're not, we typically think of programs being solved or issues being solved by government programs that are siloed in individual agencies. But I think problems today cross sectors, they cross jurisdiction, governmental agencies, and therefore require a different way to think about them. They involve more than one sector. The public sector does not have the answers to all of today's problems. Some of the issues that we face have to be dealt with in conjunction with either the private sector or the nonprofit sector. And they require more innovative solutions than we typically are able to provide in a bureaucratic setting. I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase wicked problems, and we certainly have today a lot of these sort of wicked problems. They're very complex. It's difficult to pick part of it out and solve part of it without affecting the rest of it. I just mentioned a few of these. Global health issues, for example. Healthcare costs are rising, particularly in developed countries. We have access to the greatest of technology, but it's become so expensive that it now is out of the reach of many people. We know that access to care in many countries, including the United States, remains an issue. Global pandemics, illness no longer stops at the borders. With the airlines and other things, it spreads quickly throughout the world. Infrastructure is an issue that most nations are having to deal with, whether it's an aging infrastructure or lack of infrastructure. Global warming and climate change, of course, I think now no rational individual argues that there is no such thing as global warming. Now, we may debate the causes or the solutions, but clearly we have climate change, global warming, with the potential to have extraordinary impacts on nations in different ways. And how we deal with these will become one of the real challenges of the coming century. There are some common elements to these challenges. They're multi-jurisdictional. That is, they don't stop at borders. It's not, you can't confine them within a city or a state or even a nation. They cross borders. I mentioned they're multi-programmatic. They often do not lend themselves to sort of command and control situations. Government is very good at command and control type of solutions to problems, but many of these issues are not susceptible to those type of solutions. Citizens often interact indirectly with government. Their chief contacts may be with private or nonprofit organizations. Leadership is diffused. It's not centralized in a leader at the top of a hierarchy. Rules and procedures may provide a framework, but flexibility is often key to success in dealing with some of these issues. And roles are determined by knowledge and ability, not by positional authority in the hierarchy. Now, I'm sure that you spent a lot of time on the bureaucratic model of administration. So I'm going to go over this pretty quickly. But we think of the bureaucratic model as one in which public programs are established by acts of the legislature. These acts typically determine eligibility for various programs. They often specify processes that the agencies are to follow in administering the programs. The programs tend to be housed or located and implemented in specific public departments or divisions or units or agencies of government. The programs are delivered by a cadre of professional civil servants using traditional bureaucratic delivery approaches. Hierarchical organizational structure, delineated lines of authority and approval, Action is taken on the basis of recorded and written rules. Rules are implemented by neutral officials with expert training. And career advancement in the bureaucracy hopefully depends on technical qualifications, which are judged by the organization and not preferenced by individuals. The impartial civil servants deal directly with the citizen. The services are provided equally to all who are eligible. And there's strict vertical accountability. So there's accountability from the person delivering the service up through the unit head to the department chief to the legislature or the head of the government. So these are some of the highlights, and we know that there's some major advantages of the bureaucratic structure. The reason why Weber talked about this structure in the first place was to get away from sort of favoritism and government by cronyism, right? And the idea is we needed a professional civil servants, we needed rules and regulations, we needed to have mechanisms by which we provide public goods and services. And so particularly in a broad-based democratic society with competing interests, bureaucracy serves to ensure, we hope, the equitable distribution of services. If you're eligible, you receive the services. If you're eligible, you receive the services, and you receive them equally, right? Regardless of whether you live in a particular area of the city or another particular area of the city, you're supposed to receive equal services. And so the idea is that a bureaucracy can ideally serve all citizens in an equitable fashion. It may reduce favoritism. That is, if we are providing these services, you know, in a specific way, using rules and procedures, then presumably there'll be less freedom of action to favor one group or one individual over another group. All of these are very positive reasons why the bureaucracy has flourished and why it's been a very successful tool for administrative action. I would just throw out, what are some of the other advantages of a bureaucratic form of organization that maybe you've been reading about or learning about in your own classes? Anybody want to volunteer something? Yes?
It's more or less paper, it's not subject to written procedures.
Right. Right, the classic politics administration dichotomy, which we know is not truly 100% there, but the notion is, of course, that politicians may come and go, but the bureaucracy is there. It provides some stability of administration, and therefore some guarantees to the citizens. Anything else that comes to mind? Well, you know, and I don't want to minimize the successes of bureaucracy, because bureaucracy can function very effectively. In the United States, for example, one of our most successful programs is our program of assistance to the elderly, which we call our Social Security program, right? It's a classic government bureaucratic program. Congress passed the legislation. It created the Social Security Administration to run the program. They interact directly with the citizens. The citizens are eligible by specific rules and regulations. The amount they receive is based on a formula that Congress provides. The Social Security Administration has a very good record. In fact, their citizen customer service is regarded as well as many of the major corporations in the United States, which is really astonishing for a government organization, yet that's true. And because of the quality of service and the fact that they're able to provide this in a very efficient fashion. So certainly there are some strong advantages, but we know there are some disadvantages as well. Let's see if I can get there. There we go. What are some of the complaints? Unresponsiveness, right? Rigidity, arbitrariness. Yes, everything's equal, but it seems arbitrary, right? You're not really considering the needs of the individual. Occupational psychosis is the chart. Well, that is that the bureaucracy gets so involved with itself that the organization gets paralyzed. Professional deformation. Well, you know, some of these get kind of silly, but I think that the major issues with bureaucracy is that people feel that it stifles creativity. It may demotivate employees because they're so confined in terms of what they're able to do. They're not able to use a trite phrase, think out of the box or think of new solutions. They're confined to a very set structure. Feminist scholars have argued that bureaucratic structures privilege male forms of communication, that they de-emphasize intuitive and experimental knowledge, they diminish creative capacities of employees, and encourage conformity with sort of historically male hierarchical institutions where there's more of a I win, you lose kind of phenomena as opposed to we're working towards a solution together. And so in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a whole growth of literature from the feminist movement, you know, attacking bureaucracy on the basis of communications.
If you ask for examples of disadvantages related to bureaucracy, I think the class will be more vocal than before. You ask for advantages.
Well, you know, we all know some of the problems that bureaucratic structures create, and a lot of it has to do with a feeling of powerlessness that the individual, that they're caught in almost a Kafka kind of structure where yes, everybody's treated the same, but they're all treated equally badly, you know. So you know, perhaps that's not the best solution. As I said, the movement to bureaucracy itself was a reaction against a public sector that was dominated by cronyism and special favors. You know, at one time, the chief executive simply appointed all of his pals, you know, and they were mostly pals, not women, to run the agencies, and so what sort of government services you received depended highly on who you knew, not upon a specific eligibility or criteria. We're always reforming government. I don't think government will ever be perfected, and probably through the most of the 20th century, most of the efforts at reforming the United States system of government have focused on streamlining the system, generally through more central controls by the budget office, finance office, reduction in the number of autonomous agencies so that there was more democratic accountability. And I think only recently have reformers begun to question the basic nature of the bureaucratic state. And probably the most well-noted recent critique of the bureaucratic state has been the so-called new public management movement. I'm sure some of you you've read something about new public management, and unfortunately, it's sort of an umbrella that covers a lot of different ideas, and some of them are inconsistent with one another. But because some of the advocates say we want less government, some of the advocates say we want to reform government, right? Some of them say you can't trust public managers, you got to force them to do what's right, and others say we need to trust public managers and give them more flexibility to do what's right. So sometimes it's hard to get around, you know, the new public management movement and try to understand exactly what it is. But some of the things include either reducing or redefining the role of government, using privatization and competition as a basis for improvement, using private sector expertise either in conjunction with government or in lieu of government, becoming more customer or client focused, that's often one that's cited, decentralization or devolution. Some of the work that I've done in recent years has been on decentralization of fiscal systems to provide more fiscal control at the state or local levels. More outcome orientation, so that the focus is less on inputs, but more on what government is actually doing, and greater transparency and accountability. So these are some of the sort of the basic principles of new public management. As I said, there's, you know, you know, there are challenges to looking at it because when people talk about it, not everybody means the same thing. But, okay, I've got some slides of it. Don Kettle has talked about new public management as a tidal wave of reform that's been sweeping the world. This is not only in the United States, but throughout many of the developed and developing countries. And probably privatization has been the heaviest emphasis in many of the new public management activities. But it's not just about privatization. So new public management was an important improvement. However, it didn't really question the basic bureaucratic structure, the basic hierarchical structure of government. It basically said we need to use that structure and find ways to use the private sector as a way of influencing the public sector or improving the public sector. Oops. Okay, reactions to new public management. I guess I don't have all these slides, unfortunately. Okay. All right, well. There's been a tremendous backlash from what I would call the traditional public administration folks about new public management. And I think that the charges or the arguments center around really two fundamental differences that they have with new public management. First is the great fear that public managers somehow are going to be outside of control. That is, that they're going to be these entrepreneurs who are going to go out and find solutions and somehow not tethered to strong government principles. And again, this goes back a little bit to the long debate about what is the role of the public administrators. Are we simply implementers of legislative policy, or do we have an ability to be innovative in terms of trying to adapt and initiate our own ideas? And then the other major issue, I think, is the question about democratic accountability. As one person stated in a journal article, public managers are, after all, public servants. That is, they're not business people. They're not entrepreneurs. They're supposed to be serving the public, and therefore there needs to be sort of a direct accountability from that public servant to the legislature or to the individuals who are elected. After all, public managers are not elected. You know, they are appointed by individuals who ultimately report to people who are elected. So that's some of the reactions. As I said, there was a particularly strong reaction from what I would call the traditional public administration schools because of that fear. Part of it, I think, stemmed from the fact that the professors teaching, came through their own doctoral programs in a fairly traditional public administration program that was really focused on programmatic operations, as opposed to some of these new ideas. And because of that, I think that there was a reluctance in the academic world to embrace some of these new ideas. Since then, there's been particularly just in the last 10 years, a variety of attempts to look at alternative paradigms to the new public management paradigm. And in effect saying, yes, we need change. Public managers need to be different than they are now, but maybe new public management goes too far. Or maybe it's not public servant oriented enough, And so these are some of the books that I would cite as trying to indicate some new ideas. Janet Robert Denhart, New Public Service, their 2003 book, which is really quite a remarkable book, I think, in terms of discussing the importance of citizen engagement by public managers. Goldsmith and Eggers have written a book on network management. Goldsmith was a former mayor of Indianapolis and used some privatization and other efforts to improve Indianapolis government. Solomon's effort or book dealing with the tools of government talked about a new governance, and he was looking to the fact that public managers need to look at the whole range of tools that are available, not just programs, but taxes, regulations, partnerships, networks, a variety of things. Dr. Newcomer and I wrote a book in 2008 on transformational stewardship, which took the notion of servant leadership a little bit different and argued that public managers need to be agents of change, and they need to be transformational, but they also had to sort of maintain the key core values of public service. And then finally, most recently, Donahue and Zeckerhaus wrote a book called Collaborative Governance, where they began to talk about how do managers collaborate with nonprofit organizations, collaborate with private sector organizations, and still maintain the publicness of their activities. Well, here are just some of the concepts that I think are important as we begin to go forward and think about leadership in this next century. Certainly in traditional public administration, we have three very important concepts in my mind. Democratic accountability is one, equity and fairness in the way programs are distributed, and clear expectations would be a third. But we know that that can lead to rigidness, too much reliance on hierarchy, too much process orientation, and not enough outcome orientation. New public management, flexibility, using market mechanisms, customer service, more transparency, outcome orientation, all extremely important concepts, I think. But perhaps too much reliance on the markets, maybe not recognizing that there are different motives of the private sector and the public sector, and being aware of that. And of course there is, I think, a potential for private sector exploitation in the use of the private sector in the delivery. New public service, the Denharts, citizen engagement, collaboration, two important concepts, but difficulty of building consensus. It's easy to talk about citizen engagement and collaboration, hard sometimes to build the consensus necessary to develop a program. You can't talk a thing to death forever, right? So eventually you've got to make a decision. Network management, flexibility, innovation, speed are all hallmarks of networks, but there are risks, you know, in networks. The weakest link in the network may provide a risk. Where is the accountability in a network? How do you establish mutual accountability and ownership? And can you be assured that networks maintain a focus on the more broad public interest? New governance, the notion of multiple tools. We should think more broadly about the kind of things we use. We should use all sectors, but maybe too much reliance on the other actors, right? So all of these things have sort of pluses and minuses. Dr. Newcomer's and my idea of transformational stewardship, you know, focuses on that concept of stewardship. Risk management, a concept that I particularly like is power with, not power over. Do you at all read Mary Parker Follett? Mary Parker Follett is one of my favorite management experts. She was, as is often true, a prophet before her time. She wrote in the 1920s, became very well known in Great Britain, and now has been sort of re-emerged in the management literature as somebody to really think about. But one of her concepts is that we need to focus more on how do we use collective power? How do we draw from the power of others to get things done, rather than thinking about power over people? And I think the distinction between power over versus power with is a very powerful concept. One of my public administration heroes is Don Kettle. Kettle has written often about new public management concepts or concepts going into the 21st century. And I think his 5 ideas are right on target. He says that we need a policy agenda that focuses more on problems than structures. Right? Too often we've been focused on how we do something rather than focusing on the problem itself. That political accountability works more through results than processes. You'll notice some of these themes keep coming up. That public administration that functions more organically through heterarchy, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, than rigidly through hierarchy. Political leadership that works more by leveraging action than by simply making decisions. And finally, citizenship that works more through engagement than remoteness. That is, where the manager is engaging the citizens rather than simply delivering programs to the citizens. So, what I've been specifically looking at is governance dealing with some of these new entities, some of these new choices that public managers are dealing with. Those include partnerships, networks, and some independent actors that we refer to in our book as public enterprise organizations. Now, what are public enterprise organizations? They're self-directed entities composed of businesses, nonprofit organizations, you refer to them as NGOs over here many times, or governmental units that collaborate in the production and delivery of public goods and services. And an example of this would be let's say a foundation gets together and works with the private sector on something like global hunger or on programs to alleviate deforestation, right? We think of these things as public programs, they're public purposes, and yet who are the actors? But the actors might be a foundation, it might be a nonprofit organization, it might be a business, maybe they're coming together in a network, maybe they're coming together in a loose coalition or an organization to accomplish this. And we think, well, this is pretty good, but, you know, where does the public manager fit in this arrangement? Because these entities...
The term public enterprise sector differently in Egypt here to remain to the public sector organizations that are about to be privatized. So they came up with this term, they coined it up as an intermediate phase. And after a while, all public sectors companies will turn into private enterprises. But meanwhile, in the interim phase,
they're public enterprise.
Public enterprise.
Okay,
It's a different concept.
So we're right. So we're obviously using the term in a different way. Some of the characteristics of these organizations is they're largely self-directed. So they're not within the traditional government bureaucracy, right? They're not subject to hierarchical control. They often are composed of multiple stakeholders in a collaborative arrangement. So it allows them to have diverse views and perspectives on the issue. Now this is good because it allows for multiple viewpoints in dealing with particular problems. And they're often providing public goods and services, so they interact directly with the public instead of the government acting to the public. So very different. And what we're beginning to see is the emergence of these kind of things. You know, an example would be some of the foundations like the Gates Foundation, which has been very powerful in dealing with global diseases around the country and using their financial leverage to develop alliances with pharmaceutical companies and governments in many different nations to directly deal with public problems. Or it might involve something like a coalition working in a central city to improve transportation, something that might be valuable here in Cairo, you know, in terms of more mass transit or facilitating ride shares or things. Again, achieving a public purpose, working directly with citizens, but not working under a government control. So we're beginning to see more and more of these kind of things emerge, and one of the questions is, how do public managers interface with these organizations? Well, so I want to talk about that then, and the difference between leading what I refer to as hierarchies and not hierarchies. So hierarchies and heterarchies are two different designs that represent alternative approaches to consolidating power, consolidating operations. Hierarchies represent the most centralized form or structure by narrowing the power base at the apex of the organization. Heterarchies are the least centralized by dispersing authority more equitably among multiple members. So I think of heterarchies as like a spider web or a fishnet, you know, where you have all of these interconnections, but you may not have a central node or authority. Now, this is a very simple example of a hierarchy, right? We have a Janet who's executive director. We've got two vice presidents. We have people reporting to those vice presidents. You have segmented responsibilities. Communications tends to go up the ladder, right? So James in a project leadership probably wouldn't be talking to Bill, one of the other vice presidents, right? He would have to report up through Susan, she would report up to Janet. You would get decisions made at the higher level. So this is sort of a traditional hierarchical, simplified, but traditional hierarchical structure. Heterarchy, on the other hand, prioritizes integration and involves less clearly defined structures of authority. Stevenson in 2009 referred to heterarchies as non-random aggregations of human connections with less direction provided from a central source, non-random aggregation. So they're purposeful. It's not like they just come about. They're purposeful, but they're not directed from a central source. They may have rules of operations, they may have memorandums of understanding. However, they operate more or less on an equal playing field. There isn't typically one dominant actor. And also the scope and scale of responsibilities may be less clearly delineated among the multiple partners. You may have overlapping responsibilities. That could be good or it can be bad depending upon your perspective. So again, sort of a simplification of a hierarchy, right? So we might think, well, Raj, right in the center, he seems to be a key actor here, but he doesn't relate directly to Alexandra. You know, he does so indirectly through these other actors. And so this gives you a little bit of an idea of how this web or structure might exist in a hierarchy. And again, it's one illustration among many that might prop up depending upon the particular structure of the organization. We talked a little bit about communications, and within hierarchies, communication tends to follow vertical change of command. So it leads to more siloed forms of information exchange, right? As I mentioned earlier, you don't see a lot of one department coming over and talking to another department. Instead, they're talking to their bosses. Maybe at some level at the apex of the organization, you get some cross-fertilization, but not a lot of cross-fertilization between departments. Now, we know that this is a bit of a stereotype, that we do have cross-functional teams and other things that exist even in bureaucracies. But in the traditional hierarchy, the structure is sort of siloed up the ladder. And so it creates sort of a narrow chain of communications. Hierarchies, on the other hand, thrive on information exchange. They allow for supporting, consulting, task-based relationships, not based more on what you know and what you can do, rather than what your position is in the organization. Now, we all know that in most organizations, there's an informal organization, how you really get things done, right? And so some of that occurs even in a structured hierarchy. But the idea here is in a more hierarchy, this is ongoing, right? This is the way business is done on a regular basis as opposed to on an exceptional basis. What I've done is focus then on three types of governance structures or organizations. One is governance in partnerships or public-private partnerships, and I've done a lot of work in the area of public-private partnerships. Second is dealing with networks, and third is dealing with these new organizations, which I'm calling public enterprise organizations, which are not the same as your public enterprise organization. Well, partnerships and public-private partnerships involve both hierarchy and hierarchical relationships. Right? Oftentimes in a public-private partnership, you will have some hierarchical structure. It may be under some specific government agency, for example, that's creating the public-private partnership. But once under that structure, there also are these cross-communication structures between the public and the private partner. I've done a lot of work on PPPs for infrastructure, for example, and they involve very formal tools of collaboration. There are complex contracts, right, which we think of as more hierarchical. But there's also a lot of informal communication that takes place. In fact, in the UK, which has been one of the leaders in public-private partnerships, their National Audit Office, which is their sort of umbrella management audit office, their studies indicate that the formality is important. The formal structures of accountability are important. But the more flexibility you have for ongoing communications and adjustments, the better these partnerships tend to work. That is, if you have to rely on going through and rewriting the contract in order to get things done, you know, it becomes a real obstacle to change. And so you need to have sort of ongoing informal mechanisms on a regular basis to deal with small issues and adjustments as things change. Because, you know, some of these partnership agreements are written for a 40-year period, right? And well, we know that over 40 years there's going to be a lot of changes. And if you think you can write all of that down in one contract, you know, that's just impossible. And so the contract needs to provide the framework and the accountability, but you need to have this ongoing collaboration that really makes the partnership work for the long run. Agencies working interdependently to exchange information or jointly formulate and implement policies that are usually designed for action through their respective organizations. So in other words, a network, two organizations coming together, they might, had they not joined, they might be doing similar things. But because they've joined, they're collaborating in delivering a particular service. Often networks, actors operate on sort of equal playing fields, although not always. And the ability to control the actors may be minimal because oftentimes in these networks you can always pull out of the network, right? So it is a joint undertaking that has to be to the mutual benefit of all the parties. Now again, there are things that public managers can do here, right? We have incentives that we can provide sometimes. Public sector might provide tax advantages, or it might provide access in a network that otherwise you wouldn't receive. So the networks, the exchange of information and problem solving create opportunities to capitalize in their expertise and use different approaches. Right? So again, one of the big advantages of networks is the potential for innovation, the potential to see the problem from different perspectives and to address it in more than, you know, one size fits all kind of approach. Maybe a little hard to see, but Proven and Kennis, 2008, looked at three sort of models of network governance. The first model on the left, he refers to as a self-governed network. And this is closest to the hierarchy that I was talking about, right? So you have all of these actors that basically govern themselves. Now there may be some informal agreements, there may be memorandums of understanding, they may get together you know, once a month to kind of see what they're doing, but all of them sort of act independently, but in conjunction with the other organizations through sort of a loose coalition of action. The second type of organization is a lead organization network, and oftentimes it's government that provides the lead organization, and it may be that government becomes the convener. So government agency is the one that brings the private sector actor in, or brings the nonprofit agency actor in, and helps put together the network. It may also be the financial help necessary to get the network functioning. And then finally, the type on the right is a network administrative organization. And think of that as the self-governing network that suddenly wakes up one day and say, you know, we need somebody to coordinate all of this. And so let's all decide that we're going to have a central network coordinator or organization that helps facilitate communications. And that role may be mostly a communication exchange, or it might be a very formal role. So there's a lot of different ways that you might exercise governance in that particular. And that may not be, that network administrator may not be the government agency. You know, that may be an entity totally outside of government that is simply providing a sort of glue to the other network actors. Okay, what I refer to as public enterprise organizations typically involve horizontal relationships among a variety of participants and varying forms of decentralized or centralized administration. Their unique characteristic is that they operate outside the purview of government. So government managers have very few levers to engage these organizations. But it may be that government can be a convener, help putting organizations together. Or it may be that government can facilitate access to a particular group of citizens. Or that government might be the one that is analyzing the success of some of these operations. So it provides the information necessary to determine whether successful changes are being made. So government can have a role with these organizations, but it's not the sort of direct role that we typically think about. Well, how do you lead these hierarchies? And that's really a big part of our book. And leadership is something that I've been interested in, since I started school, and continue to be interested in it. And I feel like I continue to learn about leadership. I don't think you ever become an expert in this field. And so, as we've looked at these different kinds of entities, we've said, all right, we know, and I would 100% agree with the leadership elements that were discussed at the beginning. Integrity, number one. And in fact, it's interesting that leadership scholars have over the years interviewed corporate executives. And for the last 20 or 30 years, the number one thing that they always cite as the most important leadership attribute is integrity. Right? And so this is consistent. I think it's absolutely critical for government. Communications right up there as a high number two. So I would say these are givens. So the question is, what additional needs do you have to deal in these new forms? And I think you as future public managers, are going to be dealing in this environment in the future, increasingly so. So the four things that we're arguing are important is the ability to generate support from other actors. That is, to not just think about what your own organization can do, but to think about how can I generate support and action from other entities. Secondly is to lead outside your formal role. We all have a formal role in an organization. The question is, how do we lead outside of that role? What is our informal network? that we are engaged in. And this is something that we can learn to do even at the very beginning of our career in public management, is to build our own network, to build that skill of leading, being involved outside of your specific role. 3 is understanding the wider system, focusing on the interrelationships among elements of the system. Too often, public managers, government attacks things piece by piece, rather than looking at the large system as a whole and understanding how this sector affects that, or how this particular action might affect some other part of the system. And then finally, building trust. Because dealing with organizations and networks or partnerships, consistently we hear from people that are involved in these things that trust is the glue that holds these types of organizations together. Without trust, you cannot operate in a networked, a partnership environment. So just a few minutes about these. I want to have a time for questions. But so one of my favorite leaders is a Coast Guard Admiral, Thad Allen, who happens to be a graduate of George Washington University's master degree program. Although I don't attribute his success to that alone. But he was Commandant of the Coast Guard during Hurricane Katrina, when the federal government failed so miserably. He was sent down to try to pick up the pieces. He was also the incident commander for the Gulf oil spill. So he has had some major difficult issues to deal with in his career. And his issue, what he talked about to us one day in a speech he gave to George Washington, is the need to create a unity of effort absent a unity of command. That is, he said, yeah, I'm the incident commander, but I've got nonprofit organizations, I've got private sector organizations, I'm from the federal government, I got local governments and state governments, none of whom can I command. You know, I can't order these people to do anything. So what I have to do is find a way to create a unity of effort so that we're all working towards a common purpose. We may have different goals. Private sector might want to make some money in what it's doing, you know. The non-private sector maybe wants to, you know, save the wildlife, right? Whatever their particular goal is. But the question is, how do we collectively get people together to work in a common effort towards dealing, addressing with this problem? And that's what I think we're talking about when we're talking about generating support. We need to get people to agree on what has to be done, even if we don't all agree exactly on our goals. It's all right if the private sector says, you know, I'd like to make some money out of this. Right? It's all right if the nonprofit organization says our primary purpose in being here is we want to address this particular goal that we have. That's fine. But can we get you collectively to work towards a common effort that will address the particular problem? If we can do that, then that's what we should be working for, right? We don't need to convert one another, right? We don't need to make government like the private sector, or the private sector like the nonprofit sector. They're different sectors. What we need is to find a way to generate this common effort at working towards a problem. Now, I know that's easy to talk about, hard to do, and part of it is that you've got to get people to see a vision of what can happen if we work together, right? And be willing to recognize and listen to differences, and the fact that we all have our own particular interests. You know, the mayor or the governor has a particular focus, and they're important, and you can't dismiss that. You can't simply say, well, that's not as important as this right now. You've got to recognize that they have an interest that you have to meld into that common vision in order to get something done. So the second idea is leading outside of one's formal role. And some of the concepts in here are the notion of meta-leadership, pro-social behavior, organizational citizenship. They're all ideas about how leaders can influence participants in a broad, hierarchical approach outside of their individual spheres of authority. Meta-leadership, and I'm not in love with that term, it was coined by a set of Harvard professors, and they've made a lot of money consulting using that term of meta-leadership. So I shouldn't begrudge them that, I suppose. But it's just not, I don't love the term, but I love the concept. So the concept, and I stole this from their material, so I notice I've cited them on this over. But the notion here is that you have to understand yourself, first of all, as a person. What are your capabilities? What are your limitations? You have to start with that. That you have to look at the situation and recognizing the situation is changing and be able to adjust to that changing situation. Again, Mary Parker Follett back in the 20s talked about the law of the situation. That is, you can't take one idea in and ignore what the changing situation is. You have to think about always in the context of the situation. That you do have to lead the silo. That is, you've got people working for you in a program, in a structure that you have to lead. So you can't ignore the hierarchy that's there, and you can't ignore the people above you, right? I mean, you've got bosses that you have to please. That may be the department director, that may be the governor, that may be, legislators that are going to call you to task if you don't get things done. So you have to be conscious of this sort of vertical change, but you have to also build links, leverage across organizations. Again, a favorite concept of mine also comes from the U.S. Coast Guard. One of the admirals talked about the importance of pre-need networking. Pre-need networking. What he said is, if we have a crisis and I need to call up the local sheriff and ask him to, use his helicopter to come support something that I'm doing, if I've never talked to that person before, he's going to say, I've got to get it cleared with the mayor, or I've got to go, through these I've got to get 3 signatures in order to do this right. But if you've made those contacts, if you have networked with that individual, you can often break through the red tape. People are willing to do you favors, you're doing them favors. And I really thought that notion of pre-need networking was really a powerful concept. And it really just shows how informally we can get things done if we know the people, network with the people that can help us, and that we can help over the course of our careers. I think it's pretty good career advice, by the way, just in terms of our personal careers. So that's the notion of meta leadership. Pro-social behavior, again, and organizational citizenship simply talks about doing things outside of what we're supposed to do, right? Yeah, we have our job descriptions, we have the things we've got to do, but what are we doing outside of that? What are we doing to improve the community? What are we doing to help our neighbor, to help the next department to do their job better? And maybe we don't get credit for it, but the idea is that if we had more of that, we would have more ability to get things done in organizations. Systems thinking. Are you familiar with Peter Senge and the 5th discipline, systems thinking? Sengi is another person that I think highly of, but again, this is the idea of thinking about things in a broad systems perspective, recognizing that our little piece of it is just one part of a moving multi-system organization, and to recognize that there are others involved that we have to bring into it. Again, a concept that I like is this notion of transactive memory, the ability to improve practice through what we're doing and our relationships with one another, so that if you and I have worked on a program and we've had some success, we don't just file that, but we share that in a way with the organization to allow others to benefit from that mutual success. So it's really kind of shared practice. Finally is building trust. Trust involves an enormous amount of effort, and you can lose trust. And I mean, just look at, and I don't want to talk politics here too much, but even at the national level, one day you can be a national hero and be hailed as a great leader, and the next day you can do something that everybody's mad at you about, right? And you can lose people's trust very quickly. And so it's difficult to build up trust organizationally. But trust involves information sharing. It involves deliberate efforts to get other people to work with you, right? As opposed to simply you doing things, right? And so you're building capacity within the organization or within other organizations. So trust is hard. I think it's one of the keys to leadership broadly is building trust within organizations, and nobody's perfect at it. But you can improve at it, and you can improve at it through sort of continuing to provide that, and being transparent, being open. There's always a risk with openness. Sometimes we get hurt, right? Sometimes people disappoint us, but if you don't do that, in the long run, you can't build that trust necessary for effectiveness. So these are tough issues. I would say that today's problems are complex. They're not as subject to siloed solutions. We're going to have to be involved in leading networks and partnerships that leading hierarchies as well as hierarchies will become the new norm for public managers. So I think we've got some time for questions, and I'd be glad to try to address it.
Thank you very much. This was a very informative lecture. You're surveying with us the developments in the field of public administration, going through the traditional and classical models and how people used to work within a bureaucratic setup. Many of the issues we've been discussing in our courses, and then moving through new public management, new public service. But what's new to us, the theory about how to work within a network or a coalition. Although in practice, maybe this is the main problem we're facing now in Egypt. You said you don't want to talk politics, but this is what we're doing all the time here, 24 hours. So we cannot really think about anything different when you're talking about the difficulty of working with the different groups of people, with working and serving others outside your formal jurisdiction, with creating a meta-leadership, a unity of effort, pre-need networking and building trust. All those ideas are very relevant to what we see happening here in Egypt, and maybe we'd like to hear from the students about what they think and how you associate these ideas with what's happening currently, and how would they be helpful in resolving some of the issues we're currently facing. Right, Abdullah? Need a mic?
Hello and welcome to Cairo in this very particular time. I would like to ask about three things. The first thing about the network management models. We need some examples, stories that can elaborate more on this situation of how can several actors, stakeholders work together on a particular project or policy maybe. The second thing, as bureaucracy is a service provider, it is the most cost center in the government. Our government has about 6 to 8 million employees. So how can have some ideas about converting this big bureaucracy to a profit center rather than by service deliverables, and what kind of models of transformation to internal management from a cost center to a profit center? And finally, to the hardest question we have. In a situation that the government have no money, private sector is very reluctant to borrow. There is hundreds of opportunities out there, and there's a lot of money in the banks. Then how can you put the four things together as a manager to go forward?
Well, I thought all three questions were pretty tough. No, well, let me give you an example, a couple of examples of sort of networks or these PEO type organizations. In the United States, we've developed a lot of social service networks for delivery of social service programs where government may provide the financing and provide some sort of framework, but the programs themselves are delivered through a lot of nonprofit organizations, some religious organizations, some nonprofit organizations that have an expertise in dealing with particular clientele in a social population. And they may be working together collaboratively in some cases, or they may be working alone, but they're working in a kind of broad network. Government's role there typically is both financing and as a measure of success. So government typically is the one that is looking at sort of the outcome measures. Well, what are we achieving? Another illustration of that in the private sector is the growth of what we're calling in the United States accountable care organizations. Accountable care organizations. And these are organizations of insurance companies, doctors, hospitals, some profit-making, some nonprofit, that are getting together to say, you know, we need to provide care in a better way. Rather than sort of episodic treatment, we need to look more holistically at how do we provide better care to people in a more cost-effective way so that people aren't going to the emergency rooms but are getting regular checkups. We're looking at the cost-effectiveness of medicines, the cost-effectiveness of certain kinds of treatments. Government really is playing a very little role in that, other than in the new Affordable Care Act passed by the Obama administration. They're providing some demonstration or pilot program grants. Now, but the public will benefit in two ways. One is, of course, we'll have better care, hopefully less costly care, but also we'll reduce costs to some of our government health programs, Medicare and Medicaid, and therefore that'll save money for the taxpayer. So again, this is an illustration of how private actors, nonprofit actors are getting together to address a problem of both quality and cost that's critical to improving healthcare. So two illustrations. Bureaucracy. How do you change a cost center to a profit center? I think one of the sort of an intermediate approach would be to move more towards outcome measurements, right? And I know that I'm sure you've had things on performance measurement. That's my boss, former boss, Kathy Newcomer's, that's her favorite area of expertise. But the idea is to begin to focus on results first instead of simply the money going into what we're doing. If we can get to a more results orientation, then maybe we begin to say, okay, are we structured best to provide those results? Or are there other ways that we might be able to do this? Maybe by involving the private sector, for example, or the nonprofit sector. finally, how do you get the private sector involved? Obviously, the private sector has some common needs for them to be involved in, for example, a public-private partnership. They need a stable government, right? They need a regulatory and judicial system that they can count on. If those aren't there, then the fear is that any agreement I make, any attempt at providing dollars to solve things can be overturned at the whim of a new administration. So those are important elements before I think you can get private capital going. And this is not just an issue in Egypt, it's even an issue in the United States, right? There's been a lot of uncertainty in tax policy and other things that has led to a lot of money sitting on the sidelines instead of getting involved in doing things. So, but I think that those are two elements that are critical.
We need to get the different coalitions to agree on a constitution first to answer Abdullah's question for nothing else. Right, Salma? Shaza?
My question pertains to public-private partnerships and whether these are a good model, because in Egypt here we've experienced many failures with private-public projects. Specifically so there's corruption, loss of jobs, unemployment, particularly at a sensitive stage right now that we're going through. How do you think this idea of public-private partnerships can be advertised in Egypt?
Another good question. And in fact, the article that that was just recently published in Public Integrity dealt with this issue, because I was responding to an article where they were saying all public-private partnerships lead to corruption and rent-seeking, and they're not things that the public sector should be involved in. And yet we know that there are successful public-private partnerships, so what is the key? Obviously, financial controls become an element. You can't have money being siphoned off, illegally in a corrupt fashion. You have to be willing to say it's okay for the private sector to make a profit, right? The issue then becomes, how do we measure what's getting done? Right. So if the goal is, transportation, new roads, toll roads, how do we measure the success? Well, we measure it by availability, and one of the reasons why the UK has been so successful here is they don't pay until the service is provided, right? So their idea is, hey, let's deliver the service, and then we pay based on the delivery of the service. And if you do that, then there's a strong incentive for the private sector to behave, efficiently in achieving that particular outcome. Now, if government is constantly changing the rules, or if they're constantly letting the private sector overspend and making it up for them, not holding them accountable, then you're going to have the kind of problems that you're talking about. It obviously is more. Public-private partnerships are more difficult in some countries than others because you don't have that strong legal foundation and regulatory foundation for them. But on the other hand, Egypt, as most countries, simply doesn't have the financial wherewithal, to deal with some of the issues, and so how do you leverage the private sector money to achieve public purposes, and can you do that? I mean, that's really the question in these public-private partnerships, and there are a number of things that you have to do. I mean, to make sure that it's successful. But it's easy for me to write them down in a journal article and say these are the 8 things you need to do. But doing them is the challenging part.
We'll take a number of questions. So to give
Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. Right. Right, right, right.
So that's a disaster. In the second case, with the blow-up, they have a legitimate wrong party, which is British Petroleum. So British Petroleum is going to pay for it. Anyway, that's all. And I want to say I have something like that exactly. And when I get older, I'm only 68.75 years young, I will go to Santa Fe. Because Georgia O'Keeffe and Steinke from New York City. That's my favorite city.
Right, I visited Santa Fe. They're wonderful museums for both of those individuals, right? Yes, please feel free. Well, yeah, I don't want to pretend that everything was solved in New Orleans. It was not, for example, but the mess was turned around, right? And there's a limited period in which Allen was he was largely director of the rescue effort and to get things turned around and moving. Once then, you had other agencies involved in rebuilding New Orleans, and you're totally right. That has not happened as well as it could have. So I don't want to pretend that it was a total success, but it was a success in terms of what he was asked to do. And obviously BP has got to be held accountable, and will be, but you still had to deal with the cleanup at the time, and that was a difficult issue. We'd never had something like that happen before, and one of the things that we talk about is I think public managers are going to be faced with more and more of these kind of events, and we're going to have to be comfortable in dealing with the unknown, and there was a lot of unknown in both of those situations.
The rest of the students are staying, so they have a class starting even at 7:30. So we have room for more questions. Selma, you had your hand up.
So all the forms of new public management, they're of course in a democratic context and a liberal context. But here with our different ideologies, do you think that we can work out some of these new forms of governance and public administration? Because informal networking is for sure taking place here, but with the diversities and the different ideologies, they're not working anything out. So what do you think can be a solution for this problem?
Well, if I knew the solution, I probably could win the Nobel Prize. The only solution that's going to work well for the country as a whole will be some type of compromise and accommodation for each other's interests, I think. We were talking before the lecture about how the United States in its Constitution had a very bitter election to determine its constitution, and it was fought out on a state-by-state basis, and sometimes only one or two votes separated the winners from the losers, and so it was a very hotly, probably as strong and bitter fight as is going on now in Egypt, but different lines rather than maybe largely religious lines. In the United States, it was largely around state interests versus national interests, and accommodating those two. Ultimately, the only reason we were able to get our Constitution passed is because the so-called Federalists, who wanted the strong government, agreed that one of the first things they would do is create a Bill of Rights as an amendment to the Constitution. And our first 10 amendments became our Bill of Rights. And they protected a lot of individual interests that people were concerned about. And I'm not saying that there's necessarily a good parallel, but it did involve compromise. It did involve recognizing that the other party had some legitimate issues that if we're going to be a national government, we had to address. And that was not easy to do. I mean, there were demonstrations, there were bitter words, there were what constituted the press was vitriolic at the time. So very similar. The only difference is we didn't have 24/7 television coverage of it, but similar kinds of issues. So that's as best I can do on this.
Is there this like a question or comments? When we look for the public administration issues, and I was trying to link this with economics, especially with the Keynesian theory, people have role of the government is supposed to do things, and then we see that bureaucracy has emerged. And then later on in the 80s, once, especially the IMF and others, they start moving towards this new classical paradigm, saying that we need to see smaller and efficient government, then we see this new public management theory starts emerging. So the question is this emerged because of the needs or because the paradigm is shifting, and that's as a result of the shifting on the economic paradigm has pulled this up?
Well, clearly there was a strong belief beginning in the late 70s and the 1980s that government had grown too big and cumbersome and bureaucratic, right? And so, whether the IMF and the World Bank were right in their prescription or not, is another question. There were a lot of state-run organizations. I used to take a class to the UK, and people would talk about the pre-Thatcher environment in the UK, and they said that you could wake up and you would shave and you get in your state-built car and go on your state-built roads, and you could go the whole day and never experience any private sector. Everything was owned by the government, and a lot of it was pretty inefficient, right? And as I said, it may have been equal service, but it was equally bad service, to most people. And long, we know in many countries, long waits to get telephones and long waits to get basic service. And so the move to privatize those organizations clearly was something that I think needed to happen, right? And we can argue over some of whether some are, whether it was too much but the private sector is going to be more efficient at some of those activities. There is a strong role for government, and there are things government can do that the private sector can't do or won't do because they can't make money at it. Right? But the reason why I think partnerships and networks can involve the private sector is I think that there are things that the private sector can do well and still make money, and we can still achieve a public purpose. An illustration, just a real kind of a small, very small thing was in one community, one of the major grocery chains developed a partnership with the libraries to have branch libraries next to the groceries, right? And they provided the space, and well, it was great for the libraries. It got more people coming in and reading, getting books, but it brought people in to the grocery store as well. So the company made more money, but it also achieved a public purpose. Well, I don't see anything wrong with that sort of partnership. You have to find the right mechanisms to make these things work.
it was mentioned in the presentation that managers should not just follow the rules that is already designed before, or they should be more innovative and creative and should not be just implementers. Here in Egypt, especially after the revolution, all managers are trying to change for the sake of change, and they sometimes go to the wrong decision, or they just, make bad decisions because they just want to change. So how can we manage this change? How can this change take us to move forward and to have a better situation?
Right. Well, I wrote a book about that. No, the book that Dr. Newcomer and I wrote about transformational stewardship really deals with change. And there are a couple elements to that I think are important. Is that one of the things that government has to be aware of is the various risks. As we change, who are we risking? What are we risking, right? And government has to be a manager of those risks. So that's number one. Secondly is government has to be a steward of the core values that are important to the public sector. If you lose sight of those core values, then your change is not going to be effective. So I think change is possible. In fact, I think change is inevitable and necessary. But it has to be done in a controlled fashion and with an awareness of issues such as risk, organizational capability. Not all organizations are ready for change. You know, you have to build change capacity in the organization, and that takes time. So these are some of the elements that I think are that are important. And your question is a good one, because people can get very cynical about change. You know, if we're always changing but we're not accomplishing anything, then people just say, "Oh, here's another change." You know, we'll outlive this one, right? So that's why, you know, you have to do it thoughtfully. You have to build capacity. You have to keep your goals in mind. You have to manage risks appropriately, and you have to, you know, steward those key public values. So some of the things I would think about anyway.
One last question, Omar.
Thank you. My question has to do with the concepts you talked about, especially in your book about transformational stewardship. What if and the assumption is the following, that the public managers and the public servants don't have the public interest as their top priority? This is the first assumption. And the second assumption, that the leadership actually doesn't have the most important traits, as you mentioned, such as, for example, integrity, or even communication with the people or with the stakeholders. So in that case, it's kind of extreme. However, it kind of reflects the current situation in Egypt today. How can we deal with it as citizens or as customers of this public management, and what are the alternatives that could be possible to undertake?
Well, you know, benign dictatorship seldom works, at least not in the long run. So I think you have to build things block by block. And you know, that means, you know, when you get into a position of public administration, as a public administration, you have to have strong integrity. You have to exercise the kind of things that we've talked about. You've got to serve as a role model for other public servants. It's hard to change a culture that's maybe not supportive of these kind of things, right? And you know, some of it may be pay. You know, do we pay our public servants sufficiently or not? You know, if we don't, then you know, we leave open the possibility for graft. So it clearly is a very complicated topic, and I don't want to pretend that I've got an easy answer to that. But I think in part it does mean that you just have to do it block by block, unit by unit, department by department, gradually build the kind of ethics and ethos of public interest, public service, transparency, the kind of things that we think are important in good public administration.
Thank you very much, Professor Key. We're asking you very challenging questions, and we want all the right answers there and then. But it's been a very inspiring talk. And on behalf of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, on behalf of all the student body, I have a small certificate of appreciation to hand over to you. And yes.
Thank you all for coming. I've enjoyed the discussion. I always enjoy being here in Egypt. So.
Thank you. And please, before you leave.